The massive council chamber floated in the void of space, a testament to galactic cooperation and power that had endured for over 2,000 years. And today, it buzzed with the familiar sounds of diplomatic discourse as representatives from 73 different species conducted the business of maintaining order across known space. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat in the human delegation section, a modest area near the back of the chamber where observers and minor species were relegated, and she listened carefully as the Veraxine representative bellowed about trade route disputes with the Vexian Confederacy, while her assistant, James, quietly took notes on his datapad. It had been 37 years since humanity received first contact from the Galactic Council, a moment that changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the universe. And the arrival of the sleek diplomatic vessel in orbit around Earth had sent shockwaves through every government and institution on the planet. Council's offer had been straightforward and generous by most standards: provisional membership with a clear path to full status, access to faster-than-light travel technology, inclusion in the Galactic Trade Network, and protection under Council military protocols. Yet humanity's response had surprised everyone involved in the negotiations. Earth politely declined full membership after 6 months of careful consideration and requested only observer status instead, a decision that baffled the Council representatives who had never encountered such reticence from a newly contacted species. Most species practically fought for the honor of joining the Council, eager to prove themselves worthy of standing alongside the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. But humans seemed content to watch from the sidelines and participate minimally in galactic affairs. Ambassador Chen had served in this role for 12 years now, and she had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, a skill that served humanity's purposes perfectly, even as it frustrated the more prominent Council members who expected all species to clamor for attention and status. Human delegation rarely spoke during sessions unless directly addressed, and even then their responses were measured and brief, offering little insight into Earth's true intentions or capabilities. Trade between humanity and the rest of the galaxy remained minimal, despite numerous lucrative offers from various species.
Seeking to establish profitable relationships?
And Earth exported only small quantities of cultural goods and imported basic technologies that humanity claimed would take them decades to develop independently. Council found this behavior increasingly strange as the years passed, because what species would voluntarily remain isolated when the wonders of galactic civilization lay open before them? Yet humanity continued to politely decline most opportunities for deeper engagement. Ambassador Chen watched as the Vraxan and Vexian delegates continued their heated argument about shipping lanes through contested space, and she made mental notes about the power dynamics at play between these two ancient rivals who had dominated council politics for centuries. Vraxan Empire prided itself on military might and had the largest standing fleet of any single council member, while the Vexian Confederacy relied on economic power and ancient treaties that gave them control over crucial trade routes throughout the galaxy. Between these two giants, dozens of smaller species maneuvered for advantage and protection, forming alliances that shifted with each new crisis or opportunity that emerged from the ever-changing landscape of galactic politics. Humanity remained outside these games entirely, which struck many representatives as either admirably principled or foolishly naive. Depending on who you asked about the mysterious humans from Earth, the session continued for another 3 hours, covering topics from mining rights on uninhabited worlds to disputes about technology sharing agreements. And through it all, the human delegation sat quietly and observed, without contributing to any debate or voting on any measure brought before the council. When the session finally concluded, Ambassador Chen gathered her materials and prepared to leave, when she noticed several younger delegates from recently contacted species pointing at the human section and whispering among themselves with obvious amusement on their faces. This had become increasingly common over the past few years as humanity's reputation for silence and non-participation had spread throughout the council, transforming Earth from a curiosity into something of a joke among the more ambitious species. James leaned close to Chen and whispered that he had overheard some Keltheran delegates making bets about how many sessions would pass before humanity said anything substantive. And Chen merely smiled that patient smile she had perfected over years of enduring such mockery. The human delegation made their way through the corridors of the council station toward their modest quarters, passing groups of aliens who fell silent as they approached, and then resumed their conversations with barely suppressed laughter once the humans had passed. Chun had experienced worse during her years of service, and she understood that humanity's strategy required patience and a willingness to be underestimated by those measured worth solely through visible displays of power and influence back in their quarters. The human team assembled for their daily debrief, a ritual they had maintained since the first day of humanity's observer status with the Council. James reviewed the key points from today's session, while other team members compiled detailed reports on everything from the emotional states of various delegates to the subtle shifts in voting patterns that might indicate changing alliances among council members. Shen listened carefully to each report, asking pointed questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of the complex web of relationships and rivalries that governed galactic politics. And when the debrief concluded, she sat alone in her office and composed her encrypted message to Earth. The message contained thousands of data points collected through careful observation, analysis of council procedures, assessments of military capabilities based on public information, and evaluations of political stability across dozens of species that made up the galactic community. This intelligence flowed back to Earth every single day without fail, where teams of analysts and strategists used it to build an ever more detailed picture of the galaxy. Humanity had been invited to join. Chun allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she sent the transmission, knowing that while the council saw only a quiet species content to remain on the sidelines, humanity was in fact conducting the most comprehensive intelligence gathering operation in Earth's history. They were learning everything about galactic civilization, its strengths and weaknesses, its technologies and tactics, its histories and hatreds. And all the while the galaxy dismissed humanity as too primitive or too cowardly to matter in the grand scheme of things. Let them laugh, Chen thought, as she prepared for another day of careful observation and strategic silence. Because every joke at humanity's expense was another day that Earth's true preparations continued unnoticed and unimpeded by those who thought they knew what humanity was capable of. Achieving the galaxy would learn eventually that silence and patience were not weaknesses, but tools that humanity wielded with precision and purpose. Though Chen hoped that revelation would come on Earth's terms rather than being forced by circumstances beyond their control, for now, though, the game continued, and humanity played its part perfectly while the Council remained blind to what was truly happening in the quiet corners of the galaxy where Earth built something the old powers could never imagine. The shift in how the Council treated humanity began gradually, like water wearing away stone, until one day Ambassador Chen realized that what had once been curious indifference had transformed into active contempt. It started during a routine session about resource allocation for deep space exploration, when the Vraxan representative casually referred to humanity as the species too frightened to leave their nursery while discussing which civilizations should receive priority access to newly discovered systems. The comment drew chuckles from several delegations, and Chen watched carefully as the laughter spread through the chamber like ripples across water. But she maintained her neutral expression and made no response to the provocation. Over the following months, the jokes became more frequent and more pointed as various delegates discovered that mocking humanity carried no consequences and actually seemed to earn approval from the more powerful council members. The Dexian High Speaker began making elaborate shows of explaining simple concepts during sessions for the benefit of our less experienced observers, always glancing meaningfully at the human delegation. When making such statements, Chen documented every insult and every slight in her daily reports to Earth, noting patterns in who initiated the mockery and who joined in most enthusiastically, because these social dynamics revealed important information about the Council's internal power structure. The younger species recently elevated to full Council membership proved most eager to join in the ridicule apparently viewing it as a way to demonstrate their own superiority and distance themselves from the lowly status of mere observers. Ambassador Voreth of the Keltheran hegemony, whose species had achieved council membership only 15 years earlier, became particularly aggressive in his mockery of humanity during public sessions, would make elaborate speeches about the importance of courage and participation in galactic affairs, always ending with pointed remarks about certain species who prefer to hide in the shadows rather than stand in the light of civilization. Chen noticed that Voreth always looked directly at her during these speeches, clearly hoping to provoke some reaction that would justify even more aggressive ridicule. But she gave him nothing except that same patient smile that had become her trademark. The mockery extended beyond the council chambers into the social aspects of diplomatic life on the station, where humanity's representatives found themselves increasingly excluded from the informal gatherings where real business often occurred. Invitations to diplomatic receptions became rare and then stopped altogether. And when human delegates did attend public functions, they were often left standing alone while other species mingled and formed connections. James approached Chen one evening after a particularly brutal session, where 3 different delegates had made jokes about humanity's primitive projectile weapons and suggested that perhaps they should file a formal complaint. Chen considered the suggestion carefully before declining, explaining that filing complaints would only confirm the council's impression that humanity was weak and overly sensitive to criticism, that more robust species would simply ignore better to endure the mockery and continue gathering intelligence. While the council grew increasingly comfortable underestimating Earth's true capabilities and intentions regarding galactic affairs, the situation deteriorated further when humanity attempted to negotiate a standard trade agreement for rare minerals needed and advanced electronics, a simple transaction that should have been approved without discussion. Instead, the Trade Committee delayed the request for months with endless procedural questions and requirements for additional documentation. And when the agreement finally came before the full council for approval, the Varaxan representative objected on technical grounds. Objection was clearly pretextual and would never have been raised against a more respected species. But the council voted to send the matter back to committee for further study that everyone knew would never actually occur. Chin watched the vote tally appear on the displays and made note of exactly which species voted to block humanity's request. Information that Earth would find useful when the time came to settle accounts. The pattern repeated itself across every area where humanity sought to engage with galactic institutions. As doors that stood open for other species remained closed to Earth, through various bureaucratic mechanisms and procedural obstacles, human scientists who requested access to the great archives to study historical records were told that observer species lacked sufficient clearance. Even though the same archives granted access to junior researchers from full member species, when Earth offered to contribute advanced mathematical research to the Council's scientific databases, the submission was rejected for failing to meet academic standards despite being peer-reviewed by humanity's finest minds. The message was clear. Humanity could observe, but not participate. Watch, but not contribute. Exist on the margins, but never join the real business of galactic civilization. Ambassador Torvak of the Varaxan Empire seemed to take particular pleasure in orchestrating these humiliations. And Chen suspected he viewed humanity as useful for building his own reputation among the Council's more traditionalist factions. During one memorable session, Torvak delivered a speech about military readiness and the responsibilities that came with Council membership. And he finished by questioning whether humanity even possessed a real military force. Perhaps our human friends have armed their vessels with those chemical rockets they used to reach their own moon, Torvak said with obvious amusement. Or maybe they throw rocks at their enemies and hope for favorable outcomes. The chamber erupted in laughter that continued for nearly a full minute, while Chen sat motionless and watched the delegates enjoy their joke at humanity's expense. When the laughter finally subsided, Torvak looked directly at Chen and asked if she would care to enlighten the Council about Earth's military capabilities. Since humanity had never submitted the required documentation about their defensive, Forcition stood slowly, and every eye in the chamber focused on her, eager to see how the human would respond to such direct provocation. From one of the galaxy's most powerful military leaders, she smiled that patient smile and said that humanity's military arrangements were adequate for their current needs and that Earth saw no reason to provide detailed information about defensive capabilities. To a council where they held only observer status, the answer satisfied no one and prompted another wave of mocking laughter. But Chen had avoided providing any real information, while also refusing to appear intimidated by Torvak's aggression. She sat down and resumed her careful observation while the session moved on to other matters, leaving humanity's military strength as yet another mystery that the council found amusing rather than concerning. Later that evening, Chen stood at the observation window in her quarters and looked out at the stars scattered across the void, each one representing systems where the council's authority held sway. James joined her after several minutes of silence and asked if she ever wondered whether Earth's strategy was the right approach, given how much abuse humanity endured from species that should have been there. June continued looking at the stars for a long moment before responding that the mockery was actually useful because it kept the council's attention focused on humanity's apparent weakness, rather than investigating what Earth was actually doing. Every joke about human cowardice was another day that Council Intelligence Services spent resources on other concerns instead of trying to penetrate Earth's carefully maintained security around their real military and technological development. Every insult was proof that the galaxy's most powerful civilizations had completely bought into the narrative of human irrelevance, which meant Earth's true preparations could continue without interference or even awareness. Let them laugh, Chen said quietly while watching a council patrol ship drift past the station, because the longer they laugh, the less ready they'll be when Earth decides the time has come to stop being silent. James nodded slowly and asked when she thought that time would come. But Chen had no answer because that decision would be made by others far above her position in Earth's command structure for now. Her job was to endure the mockery with grace and continue gathering every scrap of intelligence about the civilization that thought humanity too weak and primitive to matter in the grand game of galactic power. The emergency council session was called with only 6 hours' notice, which immediately signaled to Ambassador Chen that something significant was about to happen. And she assembled her team quickly to prepare for whatever crisis or opportunity the galaxy was about to present. The chamber filled rapidly with delegates who seemed unusually energized, and Chen noticed clusters of species huddled in conversation before the session began, which suggested advanced coordination that humanity had not been included in despite their observer. Storvek of the Vraxan Empire strode to the speakers platform with obvious satisfaction written across his reptilian features, and the chamber fell silent as he activated the holographic display system to show an image of Tharsis. Station Tharsis was humanity's newest colony world, a marginal planet that Earth had spent 15 years terraforming into something capable of supporting a small mining operation that extracted rare minerals from the planet's unusual geological formations. The colony housed roughly 8,000 humans who worked the mines and research stations, scattered across Tharsis's single small continent, and it represented humanity's furthest expansion from Earth in the 3 decades since first contact with the galactic community. Torvak began his presentation by citing Section 47 of the Terraforming Accord, an obscure regulation from nearly 300 years ago that required species to obtain council approval before making substantial atmospheric modifications to any world within claimed space. He argued that humanity's terraforming of Tharsis violated this regulation because Earth had never submitted the proper documentation or received formal approval from the Council's Environmental Committee. Before beginning the atmospheric processing, Chon listened carefully while mentally reviewing everything she knew about the terraforming accord, and she quickly realized that Torvak's interpretation was technically correct. Even though the regulation had been effectively ignored for centuries, more importantly, She recognized this for what it truly was, a naked attempt by the Vraxan Empire to seize Tharsis for themselves. Because recent surveys had revealed that the planet's mineral deposits were far more extensive and valuable than initial assessments suggested. Turvac continued his presentation by showing supposed evidence of environmental damage caused by humanity's terraforming process, complete with dramatic images of atmospheric changes and ecological disruption that looked damning to anyone unfamiliar with the technical details. The Vraxan ambassador concluded by demanding that humanity cease all operations on Tharsis within 30 days and evacuate the colony entirely, after which the council would decide the planet's final disposition through proper legal channels. Chen felt every eye in the chamber turn toward the human delegation section, waiting to see how Earth would respond to this direct challenge from one of the galaxy's preeminent military powers. She requested permission to address the council, and the High Arbiter granted it with obvious curiosity about how humanity would handle this situation that seemed designed to humiliate them into submission or retreat. Shun walked to the speaker's platform while her mind raced through various response strategies, weighing the costs and benefits of different approaches to this crisis that could define humanity's relationship with the galaxy. She stood before the assembled delegates and began by acknowledging the technical accuracy of Torvak's citation regarding the terraforming accord, which drew surprised murmurs from species who expected humanity to dispute the legal grounds. However, Chen continued, the regulation in question had been effectively abandoned through centuries of non-enforcement. Council members had conducted terraforming operations without submitting the required documentation. She displayed her own holographic evidence, showing examples of recent terraforming by various species, including 3 projects by the Vraxan Empire itself, none of which had gone through the supposedly mandatory approval process. The chamber erupted in heated discussion as delegates realized Chen had done her homework and turned Torvak's own argument against him, demonstrating that enforcing this regulation against humanity while ignoring violations by everyone else was obviously discriminatory. Tarak's face darkened with anger as he interrupted to say that humanity's violations were more severe, and that the real issue was Earth's general pattern of disregarding council authority by refusing to participate fully in galactic institutions. She responded calmly that observer species were not required to participate fully and that humanity had violated no regulations that were actually enforced against other species in practice rather than merely existing on ancient documents. High Arbiter called for order and asked whether humanity intended to comply with the evacuation demand or if Earth planned to contest the matter through formal legal proceedings. Paused and looked around the chamber at all the species who had spent years mocking humanity's silence and weakness, seeing the anticipation on their faces as they waited for her to either surrender or beg for mercy. Earth rejects the ultimatum, Chen said clearly, and the chamber fell completely silent as delegates processed this unexpected defiance from a species they considered barely relevant to galactic affairs. The High Arbiter asked what humanity intended to do if the Vraxan Empire decided to enforce the evacuation through military action. And Chen could hear the assumption in that question that Earth would back down when faced with real consequences. We will respond appropriately, Chen said, offering no details or threats, simply stating a fact in that same patient tone she had used for 12 years of enduring insults and mockery. Torvak rose from his seat and spoke without requesting permission, his voice carrying across the chamber with unmistakable menace as he declared that the Vraxan fleet would enforce the Council's decision, regardless of Earth's objections. He gave humanity 30 days to reconsider their foolish defiance, after which Vraxan warships would arrive at Tharsis and remove the human colony by whatever means proved necessary to accomplish that. Objective Chen listened to Torvak's threat without changing expression, and when he finished, she simply nodded once to acknowledge that she understood the situation perfectly. The High Arbiter asked if humanity wished to say anything further, perhaps to reconsider their position now that the consequences had been made explicit by one of the galaxy's most powerful military forces. No, Chen said simply. Earth's position is clear and will not change regardless of threats or deadlines imposed by species who have no legitimate claim to Tharsis. Under any regulation that is actually enforced, she returned to her seat while the chamber buzzed with excited conversation about humanity's shocking defiance and speculation about what would happen when the 30-day deadline expired. Several delegates approached the human section after the session ended to offer quiet advice that Earth should reconsider before making an enemy of the Vraxan Empire. But Chen thanked them politely and said humanity was confident in their positions. Games waited until they were alone in the corridor before asking whether Earth actually had a plan for dealing with Vraxan warships because the military imbalance seemed impossible to overcome. Chun smiled and told him to trust that Earth knew exactly what they were doing, even if the specifics remained classified above her clearance level, and that the next 30 days would be very interesting for everyone involved. She spent that evening composing the longest message she had ever sent to Earth, detailing everything about the ultimatum and the Council's reaction, along with her assessment that this represented the moment humanity had been preparing for since first contact. The response from Earth came faster than usual, just 3 hours instead of the normal 12. And it contained only 2 words that Chen read with grim satisfaction: proceed as planned. The message said, and Chen understood that somewhere in the Sol system, massive forces were already moving into position for what would come. Next, the galaxy thought it knew humanity's capabilities and had decided that Earth could be pushed around without consequences. But they were about to learn that silence and patience had hidden preparations beyond anything the Council imagined possible. Chun looked out at the stars one more time and thought about the 8,000 humans on Tharsis who were about to find themselves at the center of the galaxy's attention. They were miners and researchers who had volunteered for frontier duty, never expecting that their small colony would become the flashpoint for humanity's emergence from decades of strategic obscurity. But Earth had chosen Tharsis carefully for exactly this purpose, knowing that eventually some council member would see the mineral wealth and decide that humanity was too weak to defend it. The trap was set years ago, and now the Vraxan Empire had walked right into it with eyes open, so confident in their military superiority that they never considered the possibility that they might be the ones who were outmet Chetwanti. 9 days remained until the deadline, and Chen knew that every hour brought humanity closer to the moment when Earth would finally show the galaxy what had been built in the shadows. While everyone laughed at human weakness, she went to bed that night with a smile on her face, dreaming of the shock and fear that would replace the mockery when the Council realized their fatal mistake in underestimating the quiet species from Earth. Admiral Torvak commanded the Vraxan fleet from the bridge of the Dreadnought Crusher of Defiance, a vessel whose name perfectly captured his attitude toward the small human colony that dared to reject the Empire's legitimate claim, though. Armada consisted of 47 warships, representing the finest military technology the Vraxan Empire had developed over centuries of warfare and conquest, including 3 dreadnoughts that could level cities from orbit with their main weapon. Torvak reviewed the tactical display with satisfaction, noting how his ships had arranged themselves in perfect assault formation at the edge of the Tharsis system, ready to demonstrate what happened to species who defied the galaxy's established order. The 30-day deadline had expired exactly 3 hours ago, and Torvak had deliberately waited this additional time to make humanity sweat and reconsider their foolish defiance. But no message of surrender had arrived from the colony. Sensors showed Tharsis Station ahead, a modest collection of habitats and mining facilities on a planet that barely qualified as habitable, despite humanity's terraforming efforts, and Torvak saw no defensive installations or military vessels anywhere in the system. The colony appeared completely undefended, exactly as intelligence reports had predicted, because humanity apparently possessed no real military capability beyond whatever primitive forces they maintained around Earth itself. Torvak opened a communication channel to the colony and broadcast his final demand that all humans evacuate immediately or face the consequences of continued resistance against legitimate council authority. The response came after a brief delay, and Torvak was surprised to hear a calm human voice that showed no fear or concern despite facing overwhelming military force. "This is Commander Maria Santos of Tharsis Station," the voice said clearly. "We reject your demand and will defend this colony against any aggression, and we recommend you withdraw your fleet immediately." Torvak laughed at the absurdity of this tiny colony threatening his massive fleet, and he asked what possible defense humanity thought they could mount against Vraxan military power Terra stands. Santos replied simply. And then the communication channel went silent, as the humans apparently decided they had nothing more to say to their Conqueror. Storvac shook his head at human foolishness and ordered his fleet to advance toward the planet in standard assault formation, expecting the colonists to panic and surrender once they saw the Vraxan ships approaching. The fleet moved forward through empty space, and Torvac watched the tactical display, counting down the distance to Tharsis while his weapons officers prepared to demonstrate what Vraxan firepower could accomplish. That was when everything changed, in ways that would haunt Torvac's nightmares. For whatever remained of his life after this day, the empty space around his fleet suddenly blazed with energy signatures as hundreds of contacts appeared on sensors where, moments before, there had been nothing but vacuum. And distant starships, decloaked in perfect formation surrounding the Vraxan armada, sleek dark vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And Torvac's sensors struggled to get accurate readings on their capabilities. The tactical officer reported at least 200 human warships now visible, with more contacts appearing every second as additional vessels dropped whatever stealth technology had kept them hidden from. Vraxan sensor Storvac stared at the display in disbelief because this was impossible. Humanity was supposed to be weak and technologically primitive, not capable of building a fleet that outnumbered his own forces, and had somehow hidden in the system for weeks. More shocking was what happened too. Tharsis stationed itself as the planet's surface shimmered, and massive weapons platforms emerged from concealment. Installations that had been disguised as mining equipment or habitats, but were actually military assets. The human colony, that intelligence, described as defenseless, had more firepower than some council member species possessed in their entire military, and Torvac realized with dawning horror that he had led his fleet into a trap before he could issue orders to retreat or regroup. The human ships moved, and Torvac discovered that everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare was about to become obsolete. The human vessels accelerated at speeds that should have crushed their crews under impossible G-forces, but somehow they maintained perfect formation while closing the distance to the Vraxan fleet in seconds rather than minutes. Tactical officer was shouting about multiple incoming weapons, but the sensor data made no sense because the humans were using technologies that galactic warfare had never encountered. The first Vraxan ship died before anyone understood what killed it, simply exploding as some kind of directed energy weapon punched through shields that should have deflected anything short of a direct hit from another dreadnought. Then the second ship died, and the third, and suddenly the entire Vraxan formation was coming apart as human vessels tore through them with weapons and tactics that seemed designed specifically to counter every defensive measure the Empire had developed. Torvac watched in frozen horror as his proud armada was systematically dismantled by an enemy that moved faster, hit harder, and fought with a precision that suggested they knew everything about Vraxan capabilities while revealing nothing about their own. The human ships worked in perfect coordination, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested either incredible training or some kind of a networked tactical system that allowed them to function as a single organism. They didn't waste shots or make unnecessary maneuvers, simply identified targets and eliminated them with brutal efficiency that left no room for Vraxan commanders to adapt or respawn. Vac tried to order a retreat, but his flagships communications were already being jammed by human electronic warfare that was more sophisticated than anything in the Vraxan technical database. He watched the tactical display as ship after ship winked out of existence. 47 proud warships reduced to expanding clouds of debris in less time than it took to describe what was happening. The Crusher of Defiance shuddered as human weapons found their mark, and Torvac felt his ship dying around him while emergency systems screamed warnings that no one could address quickly enough. His last conscious thought before the bridge exploded was that he had made a terrible mistake in assuming humanity's silence meant weakness, and now the galaxy would pay the price for underestimating the quiet species from Earth. The battle lasted exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds from first shot to the destruction of the last Varaxan vessel, and the one-sided nature of the engagement shocked everyone who reviewed the tactical recordings. Not a single human ship had been destroyed or even seriously damaged during the engagement, while the entire Varaxan fleet was reduced to wreckage that would orbit Tharsis for centuries as a memorial to Hubris. Commander Santos broadcast a message on all council frequencies showing what remained of the proud armada that had come to conquer a supposedly defenseless colony. Let this serve as notice, Santos said calmly, while the cameras showed debris fields where Varaxan ships had been, that humanity will defend its sovereign territory against any aggression, and we strongly recommend that all council members reconsider their assumptions about Earth's capabilities. The message included full tactical data from the battle, specifications of some human weapons systems, and enough information about Earth's military technology to make every species in the galaxy reassess their strategic calculations within hours. The recordings spread throughout council space as various intelligence services tried to understand how humanity had developed such overwhelming military superiority without anyone noticing. The Ixian Confederacy immediately withdrew all their observers from human space and began emergency defensive preparations, assuming that Earth might decide to expand aggressively. Now that their strength was revealed, smaller species sent desperate diplomatic messages to Earth requesting non-aggression treaties and trade agreements. Suddenly eager to befriend the species they had spent years mocking as primitive and irrelevant in the council chamber. The seats sat empty as delegates struggled to comprehend that the galaxy's entire power structure had shifted in less than 7 minutes of brutal demonstration. Ambassador Chen sat in her quarters on the council station and watched the chaos unfold through dozens of news feeds and diplomatic channels. Seeing the fear and confusion replace the mockery and contempt, she had known this moment was coming for years, had prepared carefully for how humanity would handle the revelation of their true capabilities. But actually witnessing the galaxy's shocked reaction was more satisfying than she had imagined. James entered her office with a datapad showing hundreds of urgent NASU meeting requests from council members who suddenly wanted to speak with the human delegation. And Chen smiled at the desperation in some of those messages. Tell them, we'll schedule meetings when convenient for Earth's diplomatic priorities, Chen said, letting them wait the same way humanity had waited years for simple trade agreements and basic respect. The quiet species had finally spoken, and the galaxy had no choice but to listen carefully to every word, because the alternative was joining the Varaxan Empire's shattered fleet in the darkness between stars. The emergency council session was called for 48 hours after the Tharsis incident, and the chamber filled with delegates who looked significantly less confident than they had during the meeting where Torvek delivered his ultimatum. Ambassador Chen arrived early and took her usual seat in the observer section, noting with satisfaction that none of the other delegates were whispering jokes or making pointed comments about humanity today. Mood was tense and fearful as species who had built their power on military strength suddenly faced the reality that their fleets might be obsolete compared to whatever Earth had been building during decades of strategic silence. Vexian High Speaker called the session to order and immediately demanded an explanation from humanity about the military forces deployed at Tharsis. Forces that clearly violated the spirit, if not the letter of agreements governing observer species. Several other delegates rose to support this demand, their voices carrying undertones of fear rather than the contempt that had characterized previous discussions of human activity. Should listen patiently while 12 different species took turns expressing outrage about Earth's secret military buildup and deception regarding humanity's true capabilities, as if Earth had somehow been required to advertise their strength to a council that spent years mocking them. When the speeches finally concluded, the High Speaker asked if Ambassador Chen wished to address the Council's concerns about humanity's apparently massive military forces that no one had known existed. Chen stood and walked to the speaker's platform for what she knew would be the most important speech of her career. The moment when humanity would define their relationship with the galaxy going forward, she began by acknowledging that Earth had indeed maintained operational security regarding military capabilities, which was standard practice for any species that valued survival in a galaxy where it might determine right, however. Chen continued, humanity had never lied about their strength or made false claims about being defenseless. And Earth had simply chosen not to volunteer information to a council that treated them with open contempt. She activated the holographic display and showed a timeline of humanity's experience with the council, starting from first contact and highlighting every insult, every blocked trade agreement, every piece of mockery directed at Eartha. Delegates watched in uncomfortable silence as their own words were played back to them. Jokes about human weakness and primitive technology, speeches questioning whether Earth even had a real military for 12 years. I have sat in this chamber and listened to your assumptions about humanity, El Chen said calmly. And I never corrected those assumptions because they served Earth's purposes perfectly. She explained that humanity had been conducting a comprehensive intelligence operation since first contact, carefully studying galactic civilization to understand its power structures, military capabilities, technological limitations, and political dynamics of recession. Chen attended was an opportunity to gather information. Every insult was a chance to assess which species were aggressive and which were merely following the lead of more powerful members. While the council dismissed humanity as irrelevant, Earth had been learning everything about galactic warfare by studying historical conflicts, analyzing public military demonstrations, and observing the technologies that various species considered state-of-the-art. We saw how the galaxy operates, Chen continued, and we decided that if we were going to survive in this environment, we needed to be stronger than anyone suspected and more prepared than our enemies could imagine. She revealed that Earth's industrial capacity had grown exponentially since first contact, aided by advanced automation and manufacturing techniques that put galactic standards to shame. Humanity had built shipyards in the outer solar system that could produce vessels at a rate that would take council members decades to match. And every ship incorporated technologies developed through intensive research programs. The fleet at Tharsis represented only a small fraction of Earth's total military strength, Chen explained. And similar forces were positioned throughout human space in defensive arrangements that would make any invasion impossibly costly. She showed statistics that made several delegates gasp in shock. Humanity currently maintained the largest military fleet in known space, with more ships under construction in yards scattered across dozens of systems. Earth's research programs had advanced beyond galactic norms in multiple fields, particularly in areas related to stealth technology, weapons development, artificial intelligence integration, and strategic systems. The mineral wealth from colonies like Tharsis fed industries that produced equipment for millions of human personnel being trained in military operations. With doctrine developed by studying every mistake the council had made in centuries of warfare. You have been auditioning for us, Chen said, letting that statement hang in the air while delegates processed its implications. Not the other way around, as you all assumed. She explained that humanity's observer status was never about being too weak or primitive to join the council, but about giving Earth time to assess whether galactic civilization was worth joining. The galaxy had failed that assessment spectacularly through decades of corruption, injustice, and the rule of force over law that characterized council politics. Despite all the high-minded rhetoric about civilization, Chen detailed specific examples of council failures. Conflicts ignored because victims lacked military power. Trade agreements blocked for political rather than legal reasons. Weaker species exploited by stronger ones, with no consequences. We stayed silent while we decided whether this galaxy deserved to have humanity as a participant, Chen said firmly. And you have shown us repeatedly that the council cannot govern itself fairly or justly. The chamber erupted in protests and angry shouts from delegates who found this characterization offensive. But Chen waited calmly for the High Speaker to restore order. When silence returned, Chen delivered humanity's ultimatum with the same patient tone she had used for 12 years of enduring insults, and mockery. Earth would accept full council membership under specific conditions that would reform how galactic civilization operated. starting with actual enforcement of laws against all species, equally regardless of military power. Council would establish independent courts with real authority to punish violations, remove veto powers that allowed strong species to ignore regulations, and create transparent processes for all decisions affecting galactic affairs trade. And diplomatic procedures would be streamlined to treat all species fairly. Military aggression would face real consequences instead of political negotiations, and weaker members would receive genuine protection rather than empty promises if the Council accepts these reforms. Chen said clearly. Then humanity will participate fully in galactic civilization and contribute our strength to maintaining peace and order. Throughout known space, she paused and looked around the chamber at faces showing fear, anger, and calculation as delegates considered what humanity was offering and demanding if the Council refuses these reforms. Chen continued. Then Earth will create an alternative organization for species who want real justice and genuine security. And we will enforce peace in our region of space with or without Council approval. The threat was unmistakable. Accept human terms or face a rival power bloc backed by military forces that had just demonstrated their ability to destroy anyone who challenged them. Several delegates immediately began shouting objections about humanity's arrogance in dictating terms to the Council. But Chen noticed that the Dexian High Speaker and several other senior members remained thoughtfully silent. The High Speaker eventually called for order and asked how much time humanity would give the Council to consider these demands. And Chen appreciated that he understood this was a serious negotiation rather than an empty threat. Earth is patient, Chen replied. We will give the Council 6 months to demonstrate real progress toward meaningful reforms, and we will evaluate sincerity by actions rather than promises. She outlined specific metrics the Council would need to meet, concrete steps that would prove they were serious about changing how galactic civilization operated rather than just offering empty gestures. Session continued for another 4 hours as various delegates tried to negotiate modifications to humanity's demands or find ways to dilute the reforms while appearing cooperative. Chen remained firm on every essential point while showing flexibility on implementation details, demonstrating that Earth had thought carefully about what was necessary versus what was merely desirable. When the session finally concluded, Chen was surrounded by delegates desperate to understand humanity's intentions and capabilities. Species that had ignored Earth for decades suddenly eager for meetings and discussions. She scheduled appointments carefully, prioritizing species that had treated humanity with basic respect even during the years of mockery, and making clear that Earth remembered every slight and every insult. James found her late that evening still reviewing meeting requests and drafting responses to diplomatic inquiries that ranged from sincere to transparently manipulative. Do you think they'll actually reform? James asked. Or is this just going to lead to conflict between Earth and the Council's traditionalist faction?